All right, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 6. So the last we left off, we were just about to jump into the first step of working with a file. Now, if you remember back up here, we talked about the 3 steps to use a file. And the first is to open the file. So let's go back down to our slide here. When we want to open a file, we're going to make use of the open function. This is one of those functions I was telling you about that's part of the file object, and it will return a type of file object. This file object is what we were talking about, that once you have this object, now you can do all kinds of things to it, including the step 2, which is to either read or write the file. Now, when we open a file, we want to either open it in read-only, write, or append. Make sure not to forget these little single quotes, otherwise it won't work. When we are opening a file and we don't ever want to read to it, make sure you open it in read mode so it only reads the file. You don't accidentally write to it. If you open a file in the write mode and there's data already in it, that data will go away. The write function writes a brand new file in place of an existing file, or a new file if one doesn't already exist. Whereas the append, that's when you can open an existing file and write data to the end of it. So as we talked about, the open is what opens a file. Now, when you open a file, if the file name does not contain a path, then the file will be assumed to be in the same directory as the program. And not the program, not your IDLE, but rather the program where you've written your script, your .py file. When you go to open a file and you don't specify a path, it's going to look in that folder only. If the program is running and file is created, it's created in the same directory as the program if you don't specify a path. Now, you can specify a path, and you can tell the file to either open the file in a different path. And if you do that, you want to make sure that you prefix the path string with the letter R. So you're going to say open, and as we talked about, file name. But for the file name, if we want to use a path, then we have to put that letter R first. This tells Python to ignore any escape characters or special characters. You really haven't learned about escape characters at this point, but a typical path would have escape characters. Specifically, the slash is an escape character. So here we're going to say open parentheses R, and then we're going to say something like C : my file.txt. And that is where we specify the path. Oh, and then I made a mistake because we did not talk about, we have to put the comma there, and then we're going to specify a mode, which in this case we're doing the write. All right. So with that would open that file in a write mode. Make sure you put a variable name out here. And this is what is part of step 1. This is to write data. So when it comes to writing data, and up here, because we said W in our string, we're writing to a file, the method or the function that belongs to the object, this will perform an operation on that object. And on that, and the reason why I say on that object is because, like back here, we created a file that's in write mode, but it's this file. That's part of that object. So anything that we write is going to be in that file. The file object writes method used to write data in the file format. So we're going to have that file variable, which is the file object, Then we're going to say dot write, and then the string that we want to write write to the file. Once we are done writing to the file, and remember, I told you before, this is something that gets forgotten. Make sure you do this close. So the same object variable name dot close. Now, when it's time to read data from a file, we're going to use the read method. It only works if the file has been opened for reading. So if you use some other method, like here we use the W, it won't work. You have to use the read method, which is, that's the read mode. And it has to, the contents of that file is going to be returned as a string. Now, this is what happens when we do read. It reads the entire file. What if we only want one line at a time? Well, read line will read an entire line all the way up and including, and this is important, please note this, including the line break. A line break in Python is specified as that special character. Remember I was telling you about those escape characters? Well, this is an escape character. That slash tells Python, followed by an N, that that's a new line character. Read position marks the location of the next item to be read from the file. So once it's read that first line, the read position will tell it, the system, that it's now on the next line of the file. When it comes to concatenating a new line to, as well as stripping it from a string, because when we want to write data to a file, we may want to write a new line character so we can create something that has new line characters. This is important if we want to read data back as a read line, right? So if we're doing the read line, well, we first had to either have a file that already has line breaks in it, or we need to write a file that's going to have line breaks in it. To do that, we need to put that special character at the end of the data. So in most cases, data items written to a file are values referenced by variables. This is usually necessary to concatenate a inline character to data before writing it. This is carried out using the plus sign operator and the argument of the write method. In many cases, we also need to remove the new line. So when we're writing, we often want to add, and when we're reading, we often want to exclude. So again, write it, we want to add it. Reading, we want to remove it. To remove it, we're going to use rstrip, and this is a string method that strips specific characters from the end of a string. When we want to append data to an existing file, rather than using the W mode, because when we use the W mode, if that file already exists, it will be overwritten. It is important to understand this, if the file exists, will overwrite. Instead, we want to use the A mode, which the A mode says if the file exists, it is not erased, and if it does not exist, it is created. So this is kind of the best of both worlds. If it's a brand new file, the A will go ahead and write it. But if it's a file that already exists, rather than overwriting it, it will just append data to the end. Data is written to the end of the file of the current contents. So when it comes to reading and writing numeric data, numbers must be converted to strings. Because again, we are writing data to a file that is a string, and it's going to be read as a string. So any numbers that we're writing, we need to first convert to string before they're written. To do this, and now we've used other functions, like we use the int function. Well, the str function does just the opposite of the int function. And instead of taking a number and making it a string, taking a string and making it a number, the str function takes a number and makes it a string, because a string has to be written to the file. So numbers are read from a text file as a string. They must be converted to it must be converted to a numeric type in order to perform mathematical operations. All right, so this was talking about everything up here was talking about writing. This is saying numbers are read from a file as text. So you have to take that data and convert it either into an int or a float, depending on what you need. Now, you've used int and you've used float, so you're pretty familiar with those. Make sure to use the right one. If you have a whole number, you want to use the int. If you have something with a decimal, you want to use the float. When we come back, we're going to jump in to taking those loops that we've learned in previous weeks, and we're going to use a loop to process an entire file kind of one line at a time. We'll talk to you then.